Welcome back to the program. We're discussing the deadly attacks that took place in Paris on Wednesday, killing 12 people, most of them journalists working at a satirical magazine. Joining me on set to discuss this is Stanislas de Saint-Hippolyte, Washington correspondent for France 24 News Network. Joining us from our newsroom is Cedric Leighton, a well-known terrorism expert. We also have Manal Omar on the set. She is the acting vice president for the Middle East and Africa Center at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And joining us from Sacramento in California is Frank Romano, an active member of a multi-faith group in Paris. Once again, thanks to all of you for joining us, Stan. Looking at what the response might be from the state in France, are we going to see what happened in the United States? Perhaps, telephones being tapped, more surveillance, emails being intercepted. Perhaps the French might create their own Department of Homeland Security, and we'll be in the ironic situation of clamping down on freedoms to save freedom.
I think French people are quite tough when it comes to defending their freedom, and it will never be the level of security tightened like you can know in the US, for instance. I may be wrong on that, though I think it's already on high alert. What's going to be interesting to follow as well is the kind of political unity that you will be able to see after that. There is already a call for a big demonstration on Sunday. All the political parties in France have called people to come to the street to demonstrate against that, all but the Front National. The Front National is the far-right party. It's maybe 1/3 of the voters, depending on different elections. It calls itself the first party in France, and it's by its opponents, the opponents say it's anti-Muslim, which the Front National says it isn't, but still they are not invited to be part of this political unity demonstration on Sunday. That's going to be interesting to follow in France how the political division stands or do not stand through this story.
Manal, could we have a situation in France where a group like the National Front, which is an extreme right-wing group growing in support, might use an incident like this to push through anti-immigration legislation in France?
It's very difficult for me to talk about the French domestic policy and immigration in specific, but we have seen where that's been used, and particularly targeting the Muslim community and for other issues, on immigration, on other issues. And I think one of the things that we've learned, and I hope that the global community can turn to, is that we have had this past 10 years, over a decade, of really fighting a war on terror. And what we've seen, any isolation, any targeting of the Muslim community, as I mentioned before, they themselves are targeted by the extremists. So they're being hit by all sides, both by the countries that they're citizens of, as well as the extremists who are calling them infidels for not supporting them, has led to a much weaker position on our ability to fight terrorism. Whereas if we're able to actually target the Muslim community as allies, I'm confident that we will see much stronger results in fighting not only the ideology, but the actual existing cells. The first people who will be willing to turn over intelligence and information is the Muslim community, if there's guarantees that they're actually part of the process. What ends up happening oftentimes is through wide searches, through unfair laws, through us really compromising on our civil liberties, the Muslim community is now afraid and instead is really just harboring down and trying to protect itself versus stepping up to do its active duty as citizens, which would be to be part of the intelligence and part of the inform. And that weakness is primarily because of the strategy of right-wing groups that are alienating them and marginalizing the Muslim community rather than, as I said before, seeing them as potential allies, which they are very willing to be.
Frank, you mentioned earlier on freedom of expression and freedom of speech and the careful balance that has to be maintained to make sure that, the classic example that's always used is that freedom of speech doesn't give you the right to cry fire in a crowded theater. And Europe, for that matter, almost all European countries have very tough laws on blasphemy. Where does that fit in with what was being done at Charlie Hebdo?
This is the irony of exactly what happened. On the one hand, not only are there very strict laws on blasphemy, but far stricter laws on hate crimes. Remember that the Yahoo issue where you could buy paraphernalia from the Nazis online in the US was considered illegal in France. And very sensitive to that due to the history and the Vichy government, very sensitive to the issues of religious secularism due to the increasing immigration and different religion and Islam and so forth. It's the irony of the situation where, on the one hand, yes, strict laws against the blasphemy and hate crimes due to the history and the cultural reality of France and the immigration of different religions and the concentration of religion, 20% Muslim and growing in France. On the other hand, the very incredible support for satire. And saying, well, on the other hand, let's make an exception. Satire. Charlie Hebdo has satirized, lampooned the Pope, Jesus, Moses. There's absolutely, they say, look, satire opens up the story and transmit messages that we can't do by words. So this is an irony in the situation. But when Charlie Hebdo says, yes, as Mr. Charbonnier, the editor, unfortunately died yesterday, said, we do go over the line sometimes. They admit they do it because we're pushing the envelope. That's what we're there for. We're there to push the envelope, to provoke, to open up avenues of thought. That's the irony of what you just stated. On the one hand, strict blasphemy rules and racism rules. On the other hand, allowance and the need and the fervor for satire, including religious satire.
Okay, Cedric, the French Prime Minister said that the two suspects were known to the French intelligence services. In fact, one had been in prison and had a record. Was there an intelligence failure here in that respect?
It's a possibility, Anand. The reason it's a possibility is that every time that an attack like this occurs, it's actually a victory in some respect for the terrorists. Of course, the intelligence agency's job is to prevent these kinds of things from happening. Now, the reality of the situation is that Charlie Hebdo presented what they call a soft target. And it was very hard, in spite of some really top-notch efforts, very hard to prevent this kind of attack from happening. I mean, what editor gets police protection on a normal basis? What journalistic staff gets that kind of a cocoon in which they can conduct their business? It's very rare, and the French government did try to provide that, at least in part, to the magazine. But when they did that, they also, of course, were doing this over time, and the longer you do this kind of protection, the harder it is to maintain that protection, and every government that does this is going to be faced with the same situation.
Right. Stan, you mentioned just a moment ago that Charlie Hebdo will continue to be published. The print run's going to be 1 million copies next week. The long-term future of the newspaper, is that assured? I mean, France has a tradition, as Frank was pointing out, of satire. It does have a future despite the fact that most of its staff was killed so tragically.
I think they will continue, but to realize how offending Charlie Hebdo can be, you have to realize that, for instance, the New York Times decided not to publish the cartoons from Charlie Hebdo because that's too offensive. I think it will stay like that for Charlie Hebdo in France, maybe just because for a matter of pride. They don't want to be shut up by terrorists, and they will continue to do that. But it's a very particular thing in France, the right you have to make very offensive cartoons. As one humorist said in France, you can laugh about everything, but not with everybody. You have to be careful, and that may be something that they will think of now. I don't know, it's hard to tell about the future of Charlie Hebdo, but they will probably get a lot of money from donators, from people just to help them continue this job of provocating.
Right. Manal, we've heard from some scholars, some Muslim leaders, that in order to bring some common sense to this debate, in order to bring some levity to it, it's going to come from Muslims. Mm-hmm. That's where it's going to come from. So what should Muslims be doing?
Well, I think that, one, I'm not necessarily agree. Again, I think it's up to all citizens to really be able to push back. But I do think that there's a special responsibility, particularly from the religious leaders, to promote the idea of peaceful resistance, to be able to really push back on the idea that the only way to change opinion is violence. One of the things that I do primarily is work with youth all over the world. And the message that I'm sending over from Uganda to Kenya to most of the Middle East is that you have very legitimate reasons to be angry. I mean, when you're talking about a lot of the grievances, there's legitimacy, but you never have any excuse to be violent. I think the key issue is being able to put within the youth some very specific tools that they can actually exercise in terms of being able to be heard, to resist, protest, civil disobedience. There's a lot of tools that can access where they're able to express their anger. What often happens is we try to delegitimize the anger, dismiss the issues, and so then there is only one voice, which is the extremists, who are saying, come to us, we have the solution, which is violence. And I think it's very important that we're providing that counter narrative. The majority of people that I travel with, and I cannot emphasize enough, the extremists who have carried out these type of attacks in Paris, even 9/11, they're killing far more Muslims than they are anyone else. So you will find an organic traction with that message of an alternative narrative.
And that's where we are going to have to leave it. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for joining us. That's all we have time for. But the conversation continues online. Join us on CCTV America's Facebook page to comment on this or any other show, or chat with us on Twitter at CCTV America. I'm Anand, Naidoo in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching. We will now leave you with pictures of some of the victims of Wednesday's terror attack in Paris.